the most influential. It came out shortly after Kagan's. It's called Conscription and Conflict by Albert Moore. This one I highly recommend. It looks at the enlistment patterns. And while we like to think on one level, we're going to talk about some of the myths here. We're going to kind of bust them up a little bit. That there's this patriotic movement to go off and save the South from the horrible Yankee invaders. That's not always the case. And Moore looked at why people went in. Part of it was because they were drafted, or they feared the draft, and that they didn't want to be shamed into it because it would be considered cowardly to be in the draft, and it would go against all manliness to be drafted. So he looked at that, but then he also went in and he looked at class conflict. Why people deserted, and the letters coming home saying, hey, we need you here at the harvest, we've got work to do, we need you here. And the fact that other people seemed to be, the rich were kind of skirting on their duties on this. And so it really looked at the Civil War entirely differently. My personal favorite is Joseph Blather's book, Sherman's March to the Sea and Beyond, which looked at the soldiers that went with Sherman as he started from Tennessee, cut through Georgia, and then over to the coast. And as they went through, they started to witness slavery beyond simply what had been portrayed to them in either reading the book or seeing the play about Uncle Tom's Cabin. That it was much more personal, and that in fact, they became much more abolitionist as they marched. And as they came in contact, that the war that they were experiencing changed them in an ideological sense on one level. Forged in Battle is another one of Blather's works that I think is really, really quite interesting. It looks at officers of colored units in the Union Army. And that during the Army, they formed very close ties. During their service, they formed very close ties. The officers would, in fact, also go out of their way to prove their soldiers' merit, to defend them against the sometimes faceless bureaucracy of the military. But then when the war was over, they did really nothing to help their soldiers advance racially. That, in fact, they became, surely they were abolitionists. They believed in the abolition of slavery. But afterwards, there was no tie to them. They didn't try to advance them, even though they had tried in the military to fight for equality for their troops. Once the war was over, they were done. They weren't going to go out and do what we do. It's fascinating study in that regard. Another one, more damning than slaughter, desertion in the Confederate Army, again, looks at desertion, but also, and it kind of builds off more, and it gives a little bit more than Moore does, it's a little bit more up to date. But it again looks at why people chose not to fight. Again, class conflict coming into this, that the social structure that they are operating in put forces on them to have them behave in certain ways. And so that was a really good one as well. The vacant chair, this one's a particularly interesting one. It's much more along the lines of gender. And it looks not just at the soldiers, but what the soldiers being away from home meant. When fathers, husbands leave, what happened at home? How did it fit into a construct? Their letters back to their children especially are particularly poignant in looking at trying to be a father when you're hundreds of miles away, and trying to uphold the duties of what is perceived your duties as a father in that kind of gender context, and what that did to society in this slow erosion on some level of the good old-fashioned Victorian ideals. So these are really great ones. If you're going to graduate school in this, these are probably going to be on the reading list, so do it now for my students that are in here. For the rest of you, if you've got Wild to Kill, these are really good books to take a look at. They're all very easy and approachable. All right, so let's delve into it now. Now we've talked about it, now let's delve into what we're talking about. And so first we're going to do what's kind of a collective biography. Now, here's where we do some statistics. Nothing kills a good party like statistics, right? Some of you are like, I was told there'd be no math. Don't worry, all right? The statistics, I think, on one level are kind of telling. Yeah, collective biographies are always kind of you have to be very careful with them, because sometimes you can go too far with the numbers, and as Mark Twain said, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. But Just looking at some of the numbers, I think, are kind of telling. And we're going to try to make a collective biography of not just the South, but specifically the Southern Army and what that can tell us. First of all, the South in general had about 9 million or so people in it. However, 5 million of those were slaves. There were about just under 1 million or so of military age. Now, they put into service over the course of the war 750 to 850,000. That is a remarkable, somewhere between 76 and 86% of all those eligible served in the Southern Army. Now, why such a huge range? Their records just are not as clear. They were building an army from scratch while it was fighting. They didn't keep as good of records as the Northern Army did, which had already had kind of the apparatus to keep track of that kind of stuff. Plus, they had more people to do that kind of stuff. So anyway, there's range, but even still, 76, you take the low end of that, 76% is a remarkable amount of people that serve. It is really in the South, if you are a white male, one of the things that really everybody or nearly everybody did that was of military age. So you either did it or you knew lots of people who had done it, even if you yourself hadn't. Now the motivation, here we kind of see some things that I think are kind of telling. There is a change over time that happens. And part of that was because even though they had 76 to 86% go, they didn't always go as willingly as we want to believe. They had a hard time. Many of them signed up for 12-month enlistments. Some signed up for 3-year enlistments. Well, guess what? The war started to wind on, and by 1861, Jefferson Davis is watching the calendar pretty closely. Oh my gosh, these guys are going to go home. And so they started to change the rules on the game. In April of 1862, they passed the Conscription Act, the very first Conscription Act in American history, done by the South, who was advocating for states' rights against oppressive government. So there's an irony there that you shouldn't be lost on. All right, but the 12-month enlistees, part of this act was also that all the 12-month enlistees had their terms changed to 3 years. Changed the rules in the middle of the game to you. And guess what? Desertions went through the roof. There was a huge spike in desertions, not surprising. But it really wasn't meant to draft people as much as it was to encourage their enlistment. And it was meant to encourage them because being drafted carried a huge social stigma. It was seen as cowardly to be drafted. Why aren't you out doing your duty? That peer pressure that's out there. And so 80,000 enlist after the act. They enlist rather than be drafted, which is almost the same amount as the number that were drafted. And so it was effective on that regard. Now, there were some exemptions. If you were part of the war industry, you could be exempt. If you were a civil servant, if you were a clergy, you could be exempt as well. Teachers who had more than 20 pupils, they don't have to go in there. And it was funny because all of a sudden there was a great interest in being a teacher. And one white man on a plantation that had more than 20 slaves could stay. Because you don't want to leave the slaves unattended, right? You don't want to leave the slaves unattended. Now, when you look at this, there was some discontent in the ranks. One Alabama soldier wrote, "All they want is to get you all pumped up and fight for their infernal Negroes, and after you do your fighting, you can kiss their hind parts for all they care." This was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And there are many more like that. This is just one that I think is the most colorful, so I throw it up there. But there was the perception that this was a rich man's war. There is class tension that clearly is being seen in the ranks. Well, what does a typical unit look like? If there is anything. There is no such thing as a typical unit. I mean, virtually no unit was the same. But again, we're painting with a very broad brush just to kind of give you a flavor of what you might expect to see out there. In the South, there were over 100 known professions that were on the muster rolls of Confederate enlistees. 100. Now, that doesn't mean that each unit had over 100 professions. The vast majority of people would be, in both North and South, would be agricultural workers. The 19th Virginia, we'll just use this as an example, and this is actually very similar to what you would see in the North as well. They had 302 farmers. In that, 80 laborers, which could be agricultural. It's not specified, but the presumption is that at least a fair number of those would be agricultural. 56 machinists, 14 teachers, 10 lawyers, you want to put them in the front row. 3 blacksmiths, 2 artists, 1 distiller. I bet he was really popular. You put him in the back because you don't want him to be shot. 1 well digger, 1 dentist. I bet he was pretty useful too, actually, given what they were eating or not eating. And then 4 gentlemen. That's the job I want. So you can see that there's this huge diversity, although the vast majority of people in almost any unit would be agriculturally related. 9% of the Confederate Army was foreign-born. These are spread out. Some units may have more, some less, but overall, there's 9%. In society in general in the South, it was about 6% foreign-born. So just a little bit above what you would see in society at large, you would see it in the unit. Now, the average soldier, and again, as if there is such a thing, but we're going to just stereotype here, is going to be Protestant, he's going to be native-born, he's going to be white, he's going to be literate, and he'll be 17 to 35 years old. Now, when we look at white, there's a very long-standing myth out there, and there is no fact behind it, that the South put African soldiers into combat roles. Did not happen. It was raised before Jefferson Davis in 1862, and he said, "Don't ever say that again." Literally, don't ever say it. Don't even think about it until the last week of the war, the week before Appomattox, he finally authorized it, but it never happened. There is this kind of long-standing myth, and it's remarkably resilient. I'm not sure why it's so resilient, other than it's trying to minimize the impact of slavery. It's trying to say, oh, the South. This wasn't a war about slavery. It's all about rights, states' rights and all that. It's the kind of the lost cause myth that's out there. There is no evidence whatsoever that there were plenty of African Americans that were helping the Confederate Army because they were slaves. They had to. They were building field works and fortifications and doing all sorts of manual labor. And it was because of the slaves that you could have 76 to 80%, 86% of your military age population go anyway, because you had that labor back at home. But they were not. They were not in the military. So I just want to throw that out there for sure. Now, the other thing about a typical unit in the South is that, and I think this is extraordinarily important, because it changes the whole dynamic of the unit. There is always a core of veterans. The South, when there would be a depletion in a unit, they would take new recruits and put them with veteran units. So there's always kind of a core of soldiers that have seen combat, that are experienced in combat, and not only combat, but camp life, which is no walk in the park either. They're there to help the new recruits. And there's kind of a leavening that happens with that. It helps bring up the performance of the new recruits. The North doesn't do that. The North will bleed a unit dry, disband it, and then bring a new entire unit with fresh recruits back into service. Now, when they meet on the battlefield, they're going to face with the terror that new recruits always face, and so their combat effectiveness is not as good as any given Confederate. So really, this I think is one of the key differences that you see between a Confederate unit, especially later in the war, versus a Northern unit.